The Ordinary Discussion Podcast.
Just makes you realize that we're not promised tomorrow, that God has an appointed time for us and an appointed mission, and you just really have to understand that, try and just live each day as if it might be the last. And, I look at those guys and we were all sort of idealists in college. We all had these visions of being Tom Cruise and Top Gun, or, Jedi Knights and all of that. And, so we sort of all had these pie in the sky ideals, but to be honest, those guys knew the risks. They knew what they were doing. They knew the possible outcomes, and yet, they strapped it on every day and just went out there and did it. And I'm thankful for those guys.
Hello, we have another great episode for you today. Our guest today is Lindy Kirkland. Lindy lives in the Washington, D.C. metro area, more specifically Fredericksburg, Virginia, and he currently works at a high-level government contractor job doing things that, well, we'll never know. They can't tell us. Those government contractor guys I always wonder what's going on in their world. But he manages 130 individuals in that business and is a super high-level leader. Lindy is also in a local ordinary men's group in Fredericksburg, and we'll be discussing that with him, as well as his life journey, which, by the way, is really cool. You guys are going to really enjoy it. Just a couple of highlights. He flew a Cobra Attack helicopter in the first Gulf War. We're going to ask him a lot of questions about that. Then he went on to pilot Marine One during the tenure of President George W. Bush. That was during 9/11, so I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation around that. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions. We're going to make it really interesting, and I think you guys will find it quite interesting getting behind the scenes in that military attack helicopter world and the flying of a president in a helicopter. I think it's pretty fascinating, to say the least. So speaking of our podcast, if you would be so kind to click the subscribe button below if you're watching on YouTube, or like it on a podcast, or like our podcast on YouTube or on your favorite listening platform. And all our conversations point people to Jesus. And when you share and support us, you're part of completing that mission. So I'd appreciate if you guys would partner with us in that. And until further ado, let's get started with Lindy. Thanks, guys. All right, let's do this. Lindy Kirkland, how are you, sir?
I'm good.
Man, oh man, I'm super excited. I really enjoy having these conversations with quote unquote ordinary people that I often find are very unordinary, and they live very unordinary lives. And I think you are just the perfect example of that. And man, I cannot wait to jump into your story, your life journey. So thanks for being on the podcast with us. My
pleasure, man. Good to be with you.
Well, this is great. So our guest today, as you heard from the intro, is Lindy Kirkland. And Lindy, as I mentioned, lives in the Washington, D.C. area. You live in Fredericksburg, right?
I do, yes.
Yeah, so that's where I used to live. Three and a half years ago, we moved out to Vail, Colorado. And so, but I never knew you when I think we may have met once. Yeah, but we didn't really know each other. And so Lindy and I have been introduced to each other recently because he is in a local ordinary men's group. So super pumped about that, to have him part of Ordinary Men. As you know, obviously Ordinary Discussions is part of Ordinary Men. And so how are you enjoying it so far?
It's been great. I really enjoyed the sort of the extracurricular reading. The Watchman Nee books and things have been really great, helping dig in to kind of, really take our faith a little bit deeper. And so I really been enjoying that. The fellowship's awesome. I knew a couple of the guys when we started, but only 2 of the 8. And so it's been great to meet some of the new guys in the group and just to get to know them a little bit better.
Yeah. So what about the Watchman Nee books? I'll put you on the spot a little bit, or any of the other sessions has kind of stuck out to you?
It's I I attend Life Point Church, and Pastor Daniel talks a lot about how we're made up of the body, soul, and the spirit. And I never really sort of thought much about the distinctions of those, but as we're reading in this week's lesson, he really goes into a lot of detail about what constitutes the body, the soul, the spirit. And so that's just been hugely helpful as as I go back and replay in my head some of the messages that Pastor Daniel's spoken on, and just how those apply. And so it's been really excellent in that way for me.
Yeah, Daniel Floyd's a great teacher and pastor, a great friend of mine. I'll give him a little plug if you guys want to but listen to a preacher from outside your area. Look up Life Point Church Fredericksburg and Daniel Floyd, and he has some really powerful messages. Great friend of mine. But yeah, he actually is the one that gave me the first Watchman Nee book I ever had, which was The Normal Christian Life. Yeah. And he gave me that book probably, I would say 4 or 5 years before Ordinary Men, the Vision for Ordinary Men, was put on my heart. And that book, I think I started it. I think I had the same journey as you. I started it, and it felt like I was reading trigonometry almost. And then I finally, at some point, said, you know what, I just want to buckle down. And once I got into it, and once I learned his writing styles and the way he communicated, it became much easier and more palatable. And as I started digesting that material, like, God just really revealed so much about himself through the words of Watchman Nee. I really think anybody listening today, if you haven't heard of Watchman Nee, if you haven't heard of The Normal Christian Life, there's another book he wrote that Lindy just spoke of. It's called The Spiritual Man. And that's where the spirit, soul, and body is kind of dissected out and talked about in that Spiritual Man book. But man, he has a way. He's almost like the C.S. Lewis of the Chinese community, I would say. Like, he has this download from the Holy Spirit that just is unbelievable, the way that he can dissect the Word of God. Yeah. And there's stuff like that we talk about in Ordinary Men, like the blood of Christ. It didn't make any sense to me, and it's my own fault. I'm not blaming any pastors or anybody, but it never sunk into me until I read that book. And the cross, and then this whole piece, like you're talking about, the 3 parts of man. I found that's where I really found more freedom over sins that I was continually struggling in, is when I understood that I was made in 3 parts, and that what I was doing is I was living a solical life. I was so focused on my mind, will, and emotions, and I was so focused on trying to pull my bootstraps up you can relate to this. I mean, you're a military guy, like. If anybody can relate to just, you got to be tough and get over it, that's probably you.
Power through.
Yeah, and that's how I attacked sin in my life. It's like, well, I just got to get tougher. I got to get stronger. Yeah, there's probably some truth in that, but the only way that victory really comes is when you grow your spiritual man to the point that it starts influencing your soul, and then starts pushing out into your flesh, the body. And we don't have time to discuss all that today, but I would say that, well, we do have time, but then we wouldn't get to your story. But I would say that's been very impactful for me. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and to be honest too, Jeremy, the guided discussion books, the Ordinary Men book, really does a great job of kind of setting the stage for what you're going to read, and then kind of helping pull some of the truths out of what you read in those books. So I think they've been very helpful in being able to understand and digest what we're reading, and what are some pretty deep spiritual thoughts there.
Yeah, I like, obviously, I mean, I'm directing Ordinary Men, so I'm going to say I like it, but I say this, people are probably tired of hearing me say it, but it's not like my vision. It's God's vision that he put in my heart. And I like that and I'm sure that you can relate to, again, being in the military, like, we're high challenge, high grace. Like, we don't shy away from challenge. And I think we've just done so much of that in our faith that we've disenfranchised men. Like, men want challenge. Like, we want somebody to say, hey, you need to be here, and we're going to do this, and we're going to push through. And then at the end of it, like, hey, what are you going to do with the people in your sphere of influence? Like, what are you going to do with this? It's not just about, like, the Christian walk isn't about how are we going to better ourselves only. That's part of it. But it's also like, what are you going to do with it? I can relate to sports. So, like, football, I played college football. Like, everything I did was training for something. It wasn't just training so that I had it. It wasn't just training so that I could say that I trained. It was training so that I could go do something with it. And I mean, the same thing, military is probably even a better example of that. Like, you're training so that when you get called, as Lindy did, we'll talk about, to the Gulf War, like you're ready to go to battle. And I think we've forgotten some of that in our faith, that like, we're not training just to train. We're training so that we can go out and do something with it. And hopefully Ordinary Men does that for people and gives them a platform to then take that a step further. But do you have any comments on that, like men and challenge? Do you agree with that assessment?
I think so. I think, men need a challenge. It's like my wife always says, I need a project. She has to put me on a task to keep me out of her way. So I think men need a challenge, and, will often respond better in a challenging situation than if there's no pressure. We're typically procrastinators. We wait till the last minute just to sort of pressurize the situation, but that helps us to focus and get things done. And so I do think having the challenge of being prepared for the meetings with the reading and everything is a great challenge. It certainly keeps me on track and keeps me focused on getting it done.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to a clip from the Joe Rogan podcast the other day. I don't know if you know who Joe Rogan is. He's like the number one podcaster in the world or the nation, but Fear Factor guy, the whole nine yards. He was saying, he's not a believer as far as I know, based on language that I hear, some things that he says. But who am I? But that's just what I perceive. My point in saying that is only that the biblical principles go well beyond just our faith. Like it's practical in all areas of life. Like so many non-faith-based people use biblical principles in their life to become better who they are, right? And so Joe Rogan was talking, and he was talking about struggle and adding challenge and struggle to his life. And he said, if he does not have some sort of a challenge or struggle in his life, he has no joy in his life. And I thought that was interesting. And he was like, all the areas of my life, anytime that I'm really enjoying life, anytime that I'm really excited about getting up in the morning, it's when there's a challenge, even if I'm dreading it, it's when there's a challenge ahead of me. And I thought, man, that's so true in my life too, I think. Like, that's why I think I like to elk hunt and I like to do things that are challenge. I mean, I choose the hardest thing that I can find to do because it's satisfying to me. So I think that relates in our faith. Anyhow, sorry for the tangent, brother.
It's all good stuff, man.
Well, Lindy is a very humble guy, so I'm going to have to pull a lot of his accomplishments out of him today. So, Lindy, please don't be afraid to. It won't be bragging, trust me. So you can tell us the truth about what happened in your life. And I love that we're doing this right before the 4th of July, because you are a patriot, man. You are like an example of someone that has really sacrificed so much and potentially sacrificed their life for the freedom of what we have. I guess it's 4 or 5 days before the 4th. Now, I don't know when the podcast will come out, but either way, it's meaningful to me to be doing this podcast now, and it gets my mind right for Independence Day. So thanks for being on. So, Lindy, you started out in ROTC at Auburn University, right?
Yep.
So how did that journey, is that something you always wanted to do? You always wanted to be in the military, or?
Not really. I grew up in a small town, probably, a couple thousand people, small town, Northwest Florida. People ask where I'm from. I say LA, and they look at me strange, but I mean Lower Alabama. that part of Florida that we call Lower Alabama there. But grew up in a small town, and my uncle was in the Marine Corps, so I knew about the Marine Corps. I knew about serving. My dad had been in the Navy, but we weren't around it a lot. And when I was in high school, interesting story, I was a Christian, and I wanted to go to junior college where all my Christian friends were going to go, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so somewhere along my senior year, I applied for this ROTC scholarship, and I had put down Jacksonville University in Florida because my sister was there, and I just kind of filled out the application on a whim. Well, I got it, and this is maybe 3 months before graduation, and I turned it down. I wrote a letter saying I didn't want it, because I wanted to go to Chipola Junior College with all my Christian friends, and because I thought going to a big college was crazy. Well, so I'd applied for these scholarships to junior college, didn't get a one of them. So here I am about 2 weeks before graduation, and I have zero means with which to pursue my higher education. And I get called into the guidance counselor's office, and she said, "Hey, the Navy recruiter called. He's coming to present these scholarships on Senior Awards Day. Did you know you had this? And I told her the story. I said, well, I had the scholarship. I turned it down. She said, well, maybe they didn't get your letter or something like that. So right there in her office, she picks up the phone and calls the Navy recruiter. And he says, yeah, tell him we got his letter, but if he wants his scholarship back, all he's got to do is, write another letter basically explaining the circumstances. So I thought, okay, God, I get the picture now. So I did, and had it changed to Auburn, because in the meantime, I found some guys that were going there, and the rest is history. It's, God has different ideas for our path than we do many, many times. And it's best to listen to him.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how he kept you on that path, even when you were going to go astray. I think sometimes we worry so much about that in our Christian walk. It's like, am I going to make the right decision? But I think he lets us make decisions, but he has like bumper rails up in our lives. And oftentimes like the wrong decision will still lead us to the right decision. And I think at times, and I'm like the worst of it, but I overthink it, and I can't make a decision unless it's a right decision. I think God just wants us to make decisions that as long as it's not outside of what he's calling us to do. So that's a great example. I do want to talk about a picture you sent me on Memorial Day of you, and I think it was 4 other guys, 5 total. Was that right?
6 total, yeah.
6 total. I'd like to kind of close with that and just your thoughts on, that picture, what it means to you and what that means to you around Independence Day. So that's how I kind of want to close the podcast. Okay. Just kind of set that up there. But so that ROTC Auburn picture is going to be pretty meaningful. So then you graduated Auburn and then went into the Officer Candidate School?
Got commissioned in the Marine Corps at graduation. And then the Marine Corps makes you go through 6 months of what they call the basic school for all officers. And then from there, I went to flight school, got through that, and then got selected for helicopters, and made my way out to Camp Pendleton, California for initial training as an AH-1 Cobra pilot. Came back to the East Coast, did my first fleet tour on the East Coast, did 3 deployments on the ship from there, and just got some great experience doing that for a while.
So you call that a Cobra Attack helicopter, right? I mean, I did Google it, so I know what it looks like, and I watched some videos on it. Pretty darn cool, to say the least. Yeah. So you said 3 deployments. Where were those 2?
So from the East Coast, Camp Lejeune area, the Marines typically deploy to the Mediterranean as part of what they call a Marine Expeditionary Unit. We were part of the what they call the ACE, the Aviation Combat Element. It's an expanded squadron with about 25 aircraft. And so first deployment, we did a lot of time in the Mediterranean, Turkey, Israel. Actually spent some time flying in Israel, which was really interesting. And, several partner countries around the Mediterranean, flying there, Italy, Spain, Portugal, those types of things. So that was a lot of fun. Got to see some parts of the world.
Yeah. So I read that Israel actually uses the Cobra quite a bit, or used to.
Used to.
Yeah. It sounded like they may even used it more than the U.S.
They live in a very difficult region.
Yeah.
And so they have cause to use their assets a lot more frequently than we do.
Well, thank God we don't have to more. So then your first not what's it called? Not deployment then. Gulf War. What's that called?
Yeah. So that was also a deployment.
Okay, that is a deployment. Okay.
Yeah. When I left my first tour after those 3 deployments, I went to Pensacola back as an instructor, as a flight instructor. And the day I checked in is the day that Iraq invaded Kuwait. Mm. And so, of course, the U.S. scrambled. This is 1990. And
feels like yesterday, but man, that was what,
crazy.
31 years ago. Oh my gosh.
Yes, gosh. I know. So we scrambled, and then so in January I left flight instruction in Pensacola, went back to what they called a combat replacement company, did 2 weeks of training back at Camp Lejeune, and then flew over and joined Marine Aircraft Group 16. which was ashore at a place called Tanajib in Saudi Arabia. And this is early January, so it's right before the ground war kicked off in February, and all the stuff went down. So it was a very interesting time.
Yeah, so that's crazy. What would your day look like during the combat?
Yeah, so it's I was working in because I was augmented to them. I wasn't part of one of the squadrons that was attached. I did get to do a little bit of flying, but I was really in operations. And so my job was to take all the tasking that would come in through the air tasking order and then make sure that we had the various squadrons filling all of those line numbers in the air tasking order to make sure we had all the operations done. And then when the actual war kicked off, I was operating out of a remote tent in the middle of nowhere, a place called Lonesome Dove. Just a big landing zone they had scraped out of the desert, and had a couple of radios and things like that. So it was a little crazy, but it was an interesting time.
Did you fly a lot of missions or no?
No, the war itself was very short.
Yeah,
just a few days, and I did fly some post ceasefire operations, if you will, but during the actual combat days, I was really focused on the operations and making sure that we had all the line numbers filled and working with the squadrons to get that done.
Wow, that's awesome. So I read that they actually replaced the Cobra with the Apache. Is that big of a difference, those two helicopters?
So the Marine Corps did not. We actually have an upgraded version of the Cobra called the AH-1Z Zulu, and we're flying that now. The one I flew, the AH-1W model, has largely been replaced with the Zulu. So Marine Corps still flying the Cobra. It was first fielded in the 60s, so it's a pretty long-standing aircraft.
Wow, that's for sure. So then, I mean, not that that's not interesting, it's extremely interesting, but then you get another assignment. And I think that's the one that is like, wow, that's really incredible. And that's, am I right? That's where Marine One came in?
Yeah, so that was several years later. So Gulf War was early 90s. I went on, finished out my tour as a flight instructor, did a couple of school tours in there for about a year, went to the West Coast, spent 4 years in a squadron on the West Coast, couple of deployments to Okinawa, Japan. Then I came back to Maryland, to Patuxent River, Maryland, for a tour in the acquisition community, working with the Naval Air Systems Command. Went to Command and Staff College after that, and then from there, applied to and was selected to be a part of Marine Helicopter Squadron 1 there at Quantico, supporting the presidential missions.
So you started flying. So people, I'm sure most people know, but Marine One is the helicopter that flies the president of the U.S. And then Marine Two, is it the same helicopter? Marine Two is the vice president, same thing?
It's just who's on board. So anytime the president is on board the aircraft, it's Marine One or Air Force One in the case of the big Air Force jet, or Air Force Two or Marine Two if the vice president's on board.
Okay. So I have so many questions around this, so I'll try not to go too far. But so who was the president when you were flying?
So I first got to HMX-1 in June of 2001, right before 9/11 happened. And so I was there from 2001 to 2006, which was entirely during the two terms of President George W. Bush.
I just got to say, I first off, I liked him as a president, but take that aside, George W. is just awesome. I actually got the privilege of seeing him at the what's the name of it? Anyhow, he spoke in Richmond. It was just him on stage with another guy being interviewed and talking, and it was he's just such a likable guy. You had a great president to fly.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, just a super normal guy. Whenever, he would come on the aircraft, he'd always chat us up a little bit. I have a quick story. We had done a lift on the campus at VMI in Virginia. And we had landed, he went off, did the speech, he came back, got on board. And right as we were lifting out of the landing zone, we were landed on the big parade field there. we had a hydraulic malfunction, so we had to shut down, go to the backup aircraft. And as soon as President Bush gets on the aircraft, he sticks his head up and goes, "Hey, what happened over there?" And the colonel I was flying with said, "Oh, sorry, sir, we had a hydraulic malfunction. You know, we had to jump over here." And he goes, "Good thing happened on the ground, not in the air." And he kind of slaps us on the back and goes in the back and sits down. You know, so that I appreciated that. You know, just sort of a, you know, roll with it attitude, and he was really good to us.
Yeah, it cracks me up. He, when I heard him speak, I think it's called the Forum is what it's called. But when I heard him speak, he does a really good job of just not taking himself too serious, which I think would be difficult. You were the president. You were one of the most powerful man in the world at one point in your life. I heard him do a commencement or part of a commencement, and he says to the valedictoria cum salat. I can't even say it. Yada 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 to all you A+ students, congratulations. And then he says, and I like it because I'm one of the C+. And he says, to the C students, you too can be president of the United States of America. And I thought, man, that is great. That is gives us all hope. Hey, that's kind of like the ordinary man mantra, isn't it? It's like, hey,
exactly.
Being ordinary doesn't discount you from doing something extraordinary. And that all happens through obviously the grace of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. But anyhow. So then I just think it's incredible. It just shows the type of person you are that you are trusted enough to fly the most important person in the world around. It just says so much for who you are as a person. And that's amazing. Did you have to go through like crazy background checks and?
Yeah, so everybody who flies the president or has direct access to the president has, you have a secret clearance, a top secret clearance, and then you have what's called Yankee White access, which is even beyond that. And it's a very, very in-depth background check. They, dig into, 800 checkbooks old and third grade teacher and all that kind of stuff. We joke about it, but it is an extremely in-depth background check. But then the selection process to get to the squadron was equally challenging, but in a different way. At the squadron level, the selection is done in-house. They put together a board. At any given time, there are about 75 pilots in the squadron. And sort of the criteria we used was pick a guy that you would want to spend a week in a hotel room with. If you got stuck somewhere and had to spend a week in a hotel room, pick the guy that you wouldn't come out of there wanting to kill the guy. So in that sense, it was interesting. There were minimum flight hour requirements and things like that and all to get there. And so you had to meet that. But then when it gets down to it that at any given time, there are about 5 guys who are qualified as aircraft commanders for Marine One. And those are picked directly by the CO. It's just guys he trusts. And it's not always the most senior guys in the squadron.
Yeah.
It's not always the guys with the most flight time. It's really sort of who the CO and, entrusts with that kind of responsibility.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment. So, there's not just one, as I read, there's not just one Marine One, correct? Tell me how that works and the logic behind that.
Yeah, so the squadron, has to support worldwide operations, and the president may be here in DC today and in the UK tomorrow, and then back in Toledo the next day. And because of the national security requirements, everywhere he goes, there has to be an asset there available for him, whether he actually flies in it or not. In many cases, because the presidents are very sensitive to traffic and things like that, having a motorcade running through town with all the police escorts and everything causes a lot of traffic disruption. So they very often choose to fly a helicopter from the airport to the site of an event just because of those considerations. And so, you've got to have enough aircraft and pilots and crews in all of those places to cover all of those events, which during an election year can be, there could be 5 events in one day.
Yeah.
And so you've got to have assets all over the place. And then the next day, it's the same, another 5. So a lot of movement of parts and pieces, a lot of movement of people. But yeah, the aircraft has a number of aircraft available to them, and they go, all over the world to support the president.
So the helicopters will actually go across. How do you get a helicopter to Europe?
So we work very closely with the Air Force. We'll load the aircraft onto C-5s or C-17s now primarily.
You can put Marine One on a plane or a jet?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And so we stuff them in the C-17s, and C-17s will fly us to the international destinations. Sometimes if it's a time consideration, they'll fly us from point A to point B within the U.S. We won't actually just ferry the helicopters there. And, so we're able to cover a lot more ground, a lot more places that way.
That's fascinating. I just thought that it was only for inside the continental U.S. I didn't know that.
No.
Wow.
Everywhere in the world.
How fast do those helicopters go?
So, normal helicopter, you're looking at 130, 140 knots, which is about 150 or so miles an hour is max speed. So like when we were flying with President Bush, we would often go out to Waco when he would go visit the ranch. Typically, we would fly the aircraft out there, and we could do it in a day, but it was a very, very long day. Typically, we'd take 2 days to ferry all the aircraft out there, but we'd be there for a couple of weeks and then ferry them back. You can go coast to coast. 3 days is pushing it, but you can do it.
Wow. And so, man, that's just, it's so many questions in my head. But I read, or I think I heard you say, or maybe it was Chad Wevis is leading his OM group, and Chad's just fascinated by all these stories, by the way. That like, even when it's never just one helicopter, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounded like there was never just one helicopter in the region. Like you have multiple in the air at one time. It's almost like a charades game.
Yeah. Typically, anytime we're going to fly the president, there's always a backup. There's always at least 2, if not more, aircraft in the air flying. So that like in the case we had at VMI, where if one breaks, you've got an immediate backup with all the same capability. You remember, these aircraft are really there primarily as communications platforms. The president's got to be able to pick up the phone in any instant and be able to communicate with the national command authorities or world leaders or, anything like that. Yeah. And so these aircraft, in addition to being transportation, they're also there for the communication, command and control aspect that the president needs as his role in his role as commander in chief.
So that's a great segue. So you said before that it was 2001, just before 9/11. Were you, if you can, I don't know if you can answer this, but did he fly in a helicopter the day of 9/11?
So, yeah. So 9/11, you remember the president was in Florida.
Reading to some kids or something.
To some kindergartners, I guess.
Yeah.
Obviously, we were back in Quantico, and I was actually in a class that day. And I remember going into the maintenance control office in the hangar, and the first plane had just hit the first tower. And while we're sitting there watching the television, the second plane hit the tower, and everybody just kind of looked around the room going like, okay, game's on, this is different.
Yeah.
And so obviously, everything's just erupting. And so that day was very frantic. We started moving a lot of assets around. The president, as you remember, was flying to different places. And then that evening flew back into DC. And then we took him from Andrews Air Force Base back to the White House that night. And then we were moving a lot of people and president and stuff around for many, many days in and around the DC area because of the heightened security and things like that. And of course, no other air traffic was flying. If you remember that all the airplanes got grounded that day.
Yeah.
So it was really just us, the Air Force CAP, Combat Air Patrol, flying over DC and a few other assets here and there flying. So it was very, very interesting times, 9/11 and after.
So tell me, what was that like? I mean, what was the intensity level during that season? It was
huge. You talk about focus and, a pressurized situation, kind of getting your mind on things. It was literally for probably a week, just hyper focused. What's the next thing? What are we doing? What's this? What's that? Where are we going? And literally, we were moving the vice president to undisclosed locations and things like that. And then the president moved a couple of times, went to New York. So just a lot of things going on, a lot of things happening. And it was a very, very intense, focused, trying to figure out what's going on.
Did you see a big difference? I would assume. But did you see a big difference in his George Bush's demeanor during that time, or was he?
Yeah, the president was under a lot of stress, obviously, and so again, very focused and just kind of trying to figure out what the next moves were going to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Any interesting stories around that period, like close calls or anything crazy that you can talk about?
So you remember Vice President Cheney was in office then, and so we got tasked to move him around to several places on a near routine basis. Like we'd pick him up in the evening, take him to an undisclosed location, bring him back the next morning. Well, the first evening, I guess, we were flying him out of the Naval Observatory in D.C., and we'd gotten the manifest, so we thought we were expecting 6 or 7 people, and I forget. But if you remember, Vice President Cheney had these big dogs. So he gets on the aircraft and he's got these giant Labradors. And, so that's like another 300 pounds of dogs in there. And so we're looking at weight and balance. Do we have enough to get out of here and all like that? So, you run into unexpected things like that sometimes. But just a very, very interesting few days and weeks there.
Did you ever have any close calls that you would consider close calls with the president on board?
One, but I'd rather not talk about that one. It still gives me nightmares. The what if we had made that mistake, would have been.
Was it like weather related, or we don't have to get specific.
Well, we were in New Orleans actually, and it was after Hurricane Katrina or Rita, and I'll just make it very quick. Long story short, we had to reposition from the Joint Reserve Base there in New Orleans over to the Louis Armstrong International Airport. And we were just barely able to get the aircraft in. President hadn't gotten there on Air Force One yet. I grabbed the military aide and said, we're not going on this first leg. Second leg was we picked him up in an LZ downtown, and then we were going out along the coast to look at some of the damage and stuff. And then we just had some low-lying fog and things like that on the flight out from downtown down the coast. And New Orleans has all these big towers and power lines and things like that draped across the waterways. And you just kind of think you've got it cleared, and then all of a sudden you realize you can't see anything around you because you're now in the clouds. So we just some things like that. You just hope that you planned it right and make sure you take all the right precautions. But there were a couple of weather-related things like that, but nothing big.
Did you ever fly in any of the high altitude stuff, helicopter in high altitude?
Yeah, actually, we an interesting lift we did in Tucson was in August, and we're flying in Tucson. There had been some fires that had devastated a lot of homes and things like that just outside of Tucson. So we flew to Tucson, and we're flying the president. And on the day prior, we were doing the rehearsal, very small landing zone up in the mountains. And so helicopters are very affected by what we call density altitude, which is the normal altitude affected by temperature and humidity. And so the higher the temperature, the less dense the air and the less performance you get out of the helicopter. And so we were doing these landings at landing zones, 8,000 or 9,000 foot elevation. And so very, very thin air, and we had a lot of weight and everything. And, the H-60 has a thing where you get to a certain level of power, and then the fuel flow stops at that level. And so what happens then is the rotor RPM starts to decay very slowly. And so the helicopter is a lot more quiet at about what we call 92% rotor RPM than it is at 100% rotor RPM. And so we had to adjust a little bit of how we were going to do business on game day with the president on board because of some of the power constraints. But, things like that. It's just you're flying around, and you just have to make sure that you're flying and doing things as safely and judiciously as you can.
Yeah, I asked that because there's a guy that I used to go to church with. He recently went to Boulder, but It's called HATS, High Altitude Aviation Training, I think, which is like literally like 10 miles from my house. They fly out of the small airport, but I guess they bring people in from all over, like all branches and train. But he was just telling me that like helicopters act much different at high elevation, like you were saying. And I guess the gas burn is different or fuel burn is different. And then he was even explaining how sometimes you come over top of mountains and there'll be an updraft and out of nowhere your helicopter will just raise or they can be down. It was really fascinating and a little scary how complex these machines are. And so, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the heat, though. I didn't know the heat caused the air to change the way that it would eat the prop or the prop. I don't know if I'm saying it right.
High altitude and high temperature and high humidity are all bad when it comes to aircraft performance.
Oh, high humidity as well?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because the water molecules then displace the air molecules. And so you need the air molecules moving over the rotor blades or the wing to create the lift. And so it's just much less effective in very humid conditions or very hot and high altitude.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really amazing. So then from there, now you're a government contract work in Patuxent, Maryland. Is that right?
Yeah. Patuxent River.
Yeah. And so what kind of work are you doing now?
So our company, Precise Systems, supports a number of Navy, Marine Corps helicopter and weapons programs here with the Naval Air Systems Command. And so we have about total in the company, about 630 people, and that's all of our offices across the country, probably about 400 of those here at PAX. But one of my programs is still the Presidential Helicopter Program. So I still have people that are supporting the development and introduction of the new helicopters that will replace the current fleet that fly the president. As well as other programs that we support here.
That's great. And you're head over, like you're managing 130 people approximately right now?
Yeah, roughly 130 today, unless I've had a bunch quit today. So.
Let's hope not. Let's hope not. It's hard not to find employees right now.
That's right.
So what are some? So that's a pretty big leadership role. How do you any best practices and how to lead people?
Ooh, wow. Jeremy, I kind of go back to treat people like you want to be treated, Mm-hmm. There's also an old leadership saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
The way I like to manage is most of my people work on base. My office is off base. And so I find myself walking around the spaces on base, just spending, 5 or 10 minutes with most of the employees on a given day. And you'd be surprised at what people will disclose, even in those short snippets of conversation. Yeah. When you might say, like I've asked several people today already, hey, what are your plans for the 4th? What are you guys doing? And, some people will take that as an opportunity to really just share burdens that are on their heart. And so it really gives you an opportunity to minister to some people. I just recently had an employee whose husband committed suicide. She,
oh, wow.
In their 20s. And, you just, there's no real right way to deal with that. You just have to make sure that you reach out, you're there, and, give them space.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Yeah. There's terms thrown around a lot, workplace ministry, or I don't know, there's other terms for it, but people really focus on like how to teach people to minister in their workplace or create businesses around it. But I have found, just like you're saying, that the greatest ministry opportunities just come when you show people care. Yeah. It's like, we don't have to create programs around how to do workplace. It's just be like Jesus and all, not when you're just a church, not just when you're an OM group, but when you're leading people as well. And you don't have to, it doesn't have to be an in your face thing. I mean, people see Christ on you. And I've had so many people open up to me without me really saying anything. But then once they open up, now it gives the opportunity to say, hey, would you like me to pray for you? Or those type of things. And so, well, that's cool.
Yeah. I'll, typically, I'll know when employees are going in for surgeries or things like that, or have big issues going on. And a lot of times I'll take that opportunity to really and truly pray for them. But but to tell them that as well.
Yeah.
And it's surprising sometimes how much of an impact that has on people. Then they come back to you later and say, hey, I really, really appreciated that, or, that meant a lot to me, and those kind of things. And so, God puts things out there every day, opportunities for us. And, we just got to figure out how to take advantage of them.
Yeah. I think we take for granted how little people are actually cared for.
Yeah.
There's a lot of likes on Facebooks and hearts and smiley faces and hope you're doing well. But there's I think people are craving that personal interaction. And I that's awesome that you have such an opportunity with that many people to be a light. And so kudos to you. Hey, just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, Ordinary Men. This podcast would not be possible if it wasn't for Ordinary Men and the resources that they put into making it happen. We're super excited about Ordinary Men and Ordinary Women and what God's doing through it. We're taking ordinary people, empowering them, helping them realize that even though they're ordinary, God can still use them in extraordinary ways. And we're seeing that happen all throughout the country. But just don't just take my word for it. Listen to what some others have to say about it. What do you think of OM so far?
Love it. It opens the door and it directs you towards scripture and those types of things.
The Watchman Nee books and things have been really great, helping dig in to kind of, really take our faith a little bit deeper. And so I've really been enjoying that. Fellowship's awesome.
I'm excited about knowing the other guys who I don't know at all and seeing what God does in their lives through it.
It almost seems like, we're building momentum up to something more.
Ordinary Men is like a platform that gives guys the opportunity to walk through discipleship with one another.
So when Chad started Ordinary Men, I noticed a change in him over the course of the few months that you guys have been doing it.
It's just been cool to connect. It's been cool to connect and be in relationship with other people pursuing the same thing.
I'm super stoked on this program.
Well, I said I wanted to finish up. We're at 40 some minutes now. I thought we would finish up. Obviously, this is around 4th of July and Independence Day. Tell us about the picture you sent, what it means to you, and then kind of just give us a wrap around Independence Day and what that means to you.
Wow. Where to start?
And you know what? I'm gonna try to get that picture and put it on YouTube so people can see it as you speak. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I would say I'm not a person who kind of wears their patriotism on their sleeve, but I deeply love this country and having had the opportunity to go a lot of places and see how other people live and that, just the opportunities that we have here, I guarantee you 99% of Americans take it for granted, so much that we have that the rest of the world doesn't have. But growing up, I never really thought of it that way. I just kind of grew up in a very nurturing community. I grew up in a place that honored the military, honored people who served, and so I kind of was drawn to that in high school and then in college, of course. And so when I chose to go into the Marine Corps, I sort of made that decision in college as I was in ROTC, and I was very impressed by the Marines and by the self-sacrifice, if you will, and the professionalism sort of the Marines that I was around. And so I was drawn to that, and I picked to go into the Marine Corps, went through officer candidate school, and then my senior year, the picture that you mentioned, a few of my classmates graduated in the summer. I was like you, was that C+ student. I was on the almost 5-year plan, so I didn't graduate until December. But we had a graduation in June, and 6 of us that were kind of all there together, all took a picture together, and all initially went into the Marine Corps, and all 6 of us went into some form of aviation, one guy as an artillery officer and then as an aerial observer. But in that picture, one of the guys and I roomed together in flight school. I was in another guy's wedding. It's college friends. You make some lifelong friendships with the people that you spend so much time with during those formative years. And in a very short period of time after that picture was taken in 1984, I guess probably the first was my buddy Trey Wilborn was killed during the Gulf War in a Harrier accident there during combat operations on February 23rd, 91. 91. And, that was a real shock. He and I roomed together in flight school and knew him extremely well. We'd been to each other's houses, all the things that you do with those very close friends. And I think for me, that was first a realization, my first really close realization that life is short. Our time here on earth is measured. God has put us here for a purpose, and we just need to appreciate the time that we have and the friends around us. So then shortly thereafter, a second guy in the photo was killed. And was killed he had gone from the Marine Corps, switched over to the Navy, flying F-14s and flying a training mission in Tomcats. They ended up crashing, and he was killed. And then in a few years later, John Brow, another friend, I was in his wedding, was stationed here at Patuxent with him at the time. They were killed in an operational test flight of the MV-22 Osprey in Marana, Arizona. Pretty famous. There were 20-something Marines in the back of the aircraft, and all perished, unfortunately. And again, you just makes you realize that we're not promised tomorrow, that God has an appointed time for us and an appointed mission, and you just really have to understand that try and just live each day as if it might be the last. And, I look at those guys, and we were all sort of idealists in college. We all had these visions of being Tom Cruise and Top Gun, or, Jedi Knights and all of that. And, so we sort of all had these pie in the sky ideals, but to be honest, those guys knew the risks. They knew what they were doing. They knew the possible outcomes, and yet they strapped it on every day and just went out there and did it. And I'm thankful for those guys.
Yeah, there's so much there. The piece about the brevity of life and the uncertainty of tomorrow, I mean, that's all throughout the Word of God. I think at times we forget that. I talk about this often, but that became real to me when I was 30. My father died at 51, perfectly healthy of a brain aneurysm. I mean, out of nowhere, and it just, God woke me up, and it's really changed the way that I live my life. It's one of the reasons I do Ordinary Men now and do this podcast and instead of pursuing worldly wealth and trying to better my, situation, for lack of better terms. I find a lot more joy in making sure that my life has meaning and purpose, because we all think, well, we'll do that when we retire. We'll do that later. But God's calling us to do it now. And I think there's a lot of challenge that we talked about, which is good in that, a lot of encouragement in that. And we can all take time to analyze our life, even based on those stories about, man, what can I do today? What am I putting off until tomorrow that I can do today because it may not be here? But, as I was mentioning around 4th of July, I think, you said they knew the risk, yet they did it. And to me, I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional. To me, that's a big deal. What you guys do in the military, what those guys have done, knowing that they know the risk of going into it. You know that every day that you're putting your life at risk to make sure that this country remains the great country that it is. And I'm just so thankful for that, and thankful for your sacrifices and your time serving our country. I mean, you're still doing it now, and the job you're doing is still bettering our country every day. And I'm just so thankful for that. I'm thankful for the sacrifice of the lost, of those that were fortunate enough to still be around. And I just think, this last couple of years, we've kind of lost track of some of this, and we've almost become, it's like we want to be ashamed of who we are as a country, or we want to, we want to like lessen like what, not just police, but especially military, the whole 9 yards. Like, there's so much sacrifice that goes into what we have, and the ability just to have freedom to talk like we're talking right now. And I'm just so thankful and grateful for it. So, man, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Well, and I appreciate you saying that, but it is true that there are so many that day in, day out, firemen, policemen, first responders, all those guys, they know the risk every day, and they know that today they might not make it back home. And that sounds trite and it sounds cliche-ish, but I've seen it happen.
Oh, it's true.
So many times.
It's absolutely true.
I've seen it happen. And just, that those people are still willing to do it every day because it's the right thing to do. And that so many people in our country right now seems to be, they just don't respect that or don't have an appreciation of that. And that's unfortunate. And I think we just need a giant education, to kind of get people back on track and understanding, why they have what they have and how they have what they have, and the sacrifices of those who have gone before that made it all happen.
Yeah. Well, Lindy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We'll just close with God Bless America. And man, God bless America.
Yeah.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you.